American Top 40.
Here's a double-sided hit from an album called Every Picture Tells a Story. It's the number 4 best-selling LP in the nation this week by Rod Stewart. Maggie May, backed with Reason to Believe. Rod Stewart, first week on at number 36. Maggie May, 35 hits to number 1 and counting down.
American Top 40.
Here we are at the number 1 song in the USA. It's by the young Englishman who could have chosen a career as a professional soccer player. He was that good. Instead, he chose something harder. He decided he wanted to be a singer. So 6 years ago, he set out to make it in show business. He toured France and Spain for a while, singing wherever they'd let him and for whatever they'd pay him. And it was great experience, those continental gigs. Then back to England, where he sang with several groups, including John Baldry's Steam Packet, Brian Auger and the Trinity, and the Old Jeff Beck Group. In 1969, he began recording as a solo artist, and since then, he's doubled as a lead singer with the London-based group Faces. Already a star in his native England, he's now made his mark on this side of the Atlantic. Now, for the 3rd week in a row, here's the number 1 song in the land, Maggie May by Rod Stewart. Number 1 for the 3rd consecutive week in the USA, Rod Stewart's Maggie May.
American Top 40.
And now here's the current hit by the singing star who was once in a group, the Jeff Beck Group, that turned down an invitation to play at the Woodstock Festival. Now, for a while, he was really disappointed by the way it went. But now he says it's the luckiest thing that could have happened to him. Because if they had gone to Woodstock, he says the Jeff Beck Group would probably still be together. And he'd still be just a sideman. Instead, he's the solo singing star on one record label and the star vocalist with a group on another label. For Warner Brothers, he's a member of Faces. For Mercury Records, he's his own man. Here he is with Faces, Rod Stewart, and Stay With Me. Rod Stewart featured with Faces at number 20 this week at drop 3. That's Stay With Me. This is Casey Kasem on American Top 40, and we're heard every week on great radio stations around the world like WLNC, Laurinburg, North Carolina, KAST, Astoria, Oregon, and KJR, Seattle, Washington.
American Top 40.
This is Casey Kasem in Hollywood, counting down the 50 biggest records of the year 1979, the official ranking of Billboard magazine.
Number 4.
Well, there's only one former grave digger in our countdown, Rod Stewart. He says he took the job to get over his fear of death. Now, according to Woody Allen, there are 2 things in life to fear, death and sex. Well, Rod Stewart's taken care of the former. Now he's dealing with the latter. He's got the 4th biggest song of the year with Do You Think I'm Sexy? With the 4th biggest song of 1979, that's Rod Stewart and Do You Think I'm Sexy?
American Top 40.
You know, it's been almost 25 years since Elvis Presley's wiggling pelvis was censored from The Ed Sullivan Show. As Elvis sang and swiveled on that famous broadcast back in 1956, the cameras were on him from the waist up only. And 2 years ago, on a nationally televised show, practically the same thing happened. It happened at the United Nations, where a number of superstars were donating their talents for a UNICEF benefit to feed the world's hungry children. Well, among these stars was a man who was donating not only a performance, but the royalties from a huge hit song that he'd had several years before, a song called Maggie May. The problem was that the song he wanted to perform on the telecast was his then current hit, Do You Think I'm Sexy? And some people thought that this particular song and the star's performing style would not be appropriate for the occasion. And among those who had misgivings was UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, the number 1 man. So this singer, Rod Stewart, drew up a treaty with the United Nations. Stewart would get to sing his song, but without too much wiggling, while the TV cameraman, just to play it safe, would shoot Rod's performance mostly from the waist up. Which goes to show that people can usually work things out if they'll try. Well, Rod Stewart's latest hit wiggled its way up to number 5 and is on its way down this week, pausing at number 11. It's called Passion. Falling from number 5 to number 11, Rod Stewart on American Top 40 with Passion.
American Top 40.
I I'm Casey Kasem. Can you imagine a rock superstar, a man with an unmistakable face and hairdo, trying to hitch a ride on a major highway and having no one stop to pick him up? Well, that's exactly what happened to Rod Stewart. Here's the story. Recently, Rod Stewart, who lives in L.A., was going to San Diego to do a concert. He was driving in his mobile home with 8 members of his band. But just 5 miles outside of San Diego, one of the tires on the vehicle blew out. Well, instead of losing time waiting for the tire to be fixed, Rod himself walked over to the side of the road and stuck his thumb out. He figured he'd hitch a ride to the concert site to get things ready and let the rest of the band catch up with him. Rod stood there with his thumb out for 10 minutes, and the cars just whizzed on by. Not one car stopped. And that's pretty amazing when you consider that Rod Stewart is a highly recognizable, even conspicuous-looking figure and has an awful lot of fans. Well, finally, Rod just gave up, and he and his band all crowded into the mobile home on the side opposite the flat tire in order to reduce the weight on it, and slowly, the mobile home with the guys inside limped down the road to the concert hall. And they got there in time for the show. This week, Rod Stewart and his usually recognizable face debut at number 34. His song is Tonight I'm Yours. Debuting at number 34, that's Rod Stewart and Tonight I'm Yours.
American Top 40. American Top 40.
AT40 originates in Hollywood. Well, now we're up to the rock superstar with the raspy, gravelly voice. The man behind big hit rockers like Hot Legs, soulful ballads like Tonight's the Night and You're in My Heart, and story songs like Maggie May and Young Turks. Of course, I'm talking about Rod Stewart. His songs and his style have made him one of the biggest male sex symbols in rock and roll. On stage, he plays with that image. He flaunts it, strutting with his hand on his hip, having a good time with his audience. But it wasn't always that way. There was a time when Rod Stewart was afraid of big audiences. It was back in 1969 when he was the lead singer of a band called the Jeff Beck Group. They were making their American concert debut in New York City at the Fillmore East. And Rod was so nervous, his voice gave out during the first line of the first song. His voice came back, but he spent the rest of the night hiding behind the stacks of amplifiers and speakers while he sang. Critics wrote that the Jeff Beck Group was great, especially the lead singer, only they didn't understand why he hid behind the amps. Well, the Jeff Beck Group crisscrossed America with 7 concert tours in 1969, and Rod Stewart turned his fear of big audiences into triumph and came into his own as a performer. Since the early 70s, he's had no problem singing for a crowd of any size and strutting in full view. His latest hit climbs 3 notches this week to number 16. Here's Rod Stewart and Baby Jane. Currently the number 1 song in England at number 16 and moving up 3 notches on American Top 40. Baby Jane by Rod Stewart.
American Top 40. Top 40.
Now on AT40, we're up to the superstar who once went to extremes in order to conquer one of his fears. Sometimes the only way to overcome an irrational fear is to face up to it. That's what many people do to get over their fear of swimming or of flying. But what do you do if your fear runs a lot deeper than water or airplanes? What do you do if your problem is thanatophobia? If it's death you're terrified of? That's the situation that confronted rock superstar Rod Stewart. The Englishman says, "When I was 17, I was so scared of dying that I developed a real phobia about it. I just suddenly realized that we all had to die." Rod says he became so terrified of death he could hardly function. He was literally afraid to go out of the house. But he also knew that he couldn't go through life like that, so he says, "I took a job in London in the Highgate Cemetery digging graves." And Rod Stewart says that daily shock of dealing with the dead as a gravedigger made him realize that death is just another part of life, and that when you're alive, what you've got to do is live. These days, Rod Stewart says he's no more afraid of death than anyone else. His current hit is at number 14 this week on American Top 40. Rod Stewart with Some Guys Have All the Luck. Last week, Rod Stewart climbed as high as number 10 with his hit, Some Guys Have All the Luck. This week, it falls to 14 in our countdown. It's from the LP Camouflage as the countdown continues.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
We're counting down the nation's biggest hits by the world's biggest pop stars. Now we're up to the superstar whose passion for rock and roll is equaled by his passion for soccer. That's what Americans and Canadians call it, soccer. The rest of the world calls it football. Well, one of pop music's biggest soccer fans, a confessed soccer nut, is Rod Stewart. Rod plays in a local amateur soccer league here in L.A. Almost every Sunday they play a game, and nothing keeps Rod from it. I mean nothing. One Saturday night last December in Tampa, Florida, Rod sang in a sold-out arena filled with 40,000 fans. Then, after the concert ended, he raced to the airport, caught a midnight plane, and flew 3,000 miles back across the USA to L.A. so that he wouldn't miss playing his regular Sunday soccer match. 41-year-old Rod Stewart not only loves to play soccer, he's also a huge fan. His favorite team is the Scottish national team. And last year, when Rod couldn't receive one of their games on television or the radio, he called his father in Britain and had Dad hold up the telephone to a British radio so Rod could catch all the action. That's soccer devotion. This week, Rod Stewart's at number 11 on American Top 40 with his latest hit, Love Touch. The theme from Legal Eagles, Love Touch by Rod Stewart. Got as high as number 6. That was last week. This week it falls to number 11.
With Casey Kasem.
I'm Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to our story of Rod Stewart's 2-week career as a professional soccer player. In America, kids grow up dreaming of playing baseball. In Britain, they dream about playing soccer. And young Rod had wanted to be a soccer player ever since he could remember. His dream came true when he was hired by a professional soccer team at the age of 17. But then the dream turned into a nightmare when Rod discovered how the apprentice players on the team really earned their money. Not by kicking the ball around, as he'd imagined, but by cleaning the mud off the boots of the more experienced, more accomplished members of the team, the ones who were kicking the ball around. Rod was so disappointed that he quit the team after only 2 weeks. Broke and unemployed, he headed to Europe with a harmonica. And that's when Rod discovered his true calling as a musician and singer. He never went back to playing professional soccer, but he still loves the sport. And now he plays every Sunday in a park in Los Angeles with a team of British expatriates who are good enough to be considered semi-professional. And no, Rod doesn't clean the boots of any of the players. But Rod Stewart's been cleaning up in show business for years. Here he is debuting on this week's countdown at number 38 with My Heart Can't Tell You No. Rod Stewart with the 19th Top 40 hit of his 18-year chart career. Debuting at number 38 on Casey's Top 40, My Heart Can't Tell You No.
Casey's Top 40.
Now we're up to the brand new number 1 song in the USA on Casey's Top 40, and it's by an English superstar who's proven he's there when a stranger needs help. Here's the story. It was just a few months ago that he was tooling down Hollywood Sunset Boulevard in his Porsche, heading home after a long day in the studio. Suddenly, about a block ahead of him, he saw a car that was moving too fast go out of control, hit the curb, and flip over in a shower of sparks. Sadly, some people might have just looked the other way, driven by, or stopped somewhere else to call the police. But without even thinking, Rod Stewart immediately flew into action. He leaped out of his car, ran to the overturned vehicle, where he found 2 men inside. One was all right, the other was bleeding heavily from his arm. Rod helped pull the men from the car. Then he ripped off his T-shirt, tied it into a makeshift tourniquet to slow the bleeding. By that time, an ambulance had arrived. But that wasn't the end of Rod's involvement. He followed the ambulance with the injured driver inside to a nearby hospital and wouldn't leave until he was assured the man was going to be all right. And why did Rod Stewart go to such unusual lengths to help a fellow citizen? Well, he says, quote, I figure someday something like that might happen to me, and I'd want someone to help me the same way. Like we used to say, what goes around, comes around. Well, what's coming around this week for Good Samaritan Rod Stewart is his biggest hit in 11 years, as his latest single becomes his 5th number 1. The brand new number 1 song in the USA on Casey's Top 40 is Downtown Train by Rod Stewart. And there it is, the brand new number 1 song in the USA, Downtown Train by Rod Stewart.
Casey's Top 40.
I'm Casey Kasem. Casey's Top 40 originates in Hollywood. Now, we're up to another of those amazing The Show Must Go On stories. A few months ago, Rod Stewart was coming toward the end of a year-long world tour. Rod was feeling good about it. The tour had been a lot of work, but he played to more people than he ever had before. One night he was doing a concert north of San Francisco, and things were going just great. But because of the size of the stage, all the lights and equipment had to be set up very differently. For most of the show, as Rod ran back and forth, he managed to avoid the poles that were holding up the lights. But towards the end, right in the middle of singing Do You Think I'm Sexy, Rod made the mistake of looking right while he was dancing left, and he smashed full tilt into one of those poles. Rod hit it so hard, he was knocked out cold. As he fell to the floor, the microphone still clutched in his hand, the audience gasped. Rod's roadies rushed out to help him. They wrapped a towel around his bleeding head and carried him backstage. Rod was out cold for a full 3 minutes before he started to slowly regain consciousness. And then, to the amazement of all those around him, he stood up and insisted on going back on stage. Before the mishap, he was almost at the end of the show, and his audience certainly would have gone home satisfied. But to Rod, that didn't matter. He hadn't given them everything he had. So he quickly changed into fresh clothes, cleaned up a bit, and then went back on stage to a tumultuous cheer. He did another 15 minutes, and he says he saw double for most of that time. But he knew the show had to go on. That's the sort of dedication and spirit Rod Stewart has brought to his shows for the past 2 decades, and to his songs as well. This week, the latest hit by Rod Stewart is a knockout in itself, a duet with Ronald Isley. They climb a notch to number 7 on Casey's Top 40 with This Old Heart of Mine. In their 7th week in the countdown, Rod Stewart and Ronald Isley move up a notch to number 7 with This Old Heart of Mine.
Casey's Countdown.
I'm Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to a Casey's Countdown Extra, the number 1 smash, Reason to Believe. It's by a British superstar who's been a brunette, a blonde, and now he's a redhead. Rod Stewart is a natural brunette. His hair is brown, but it's been a long time since anyone has seen Rod that way. You see, he started dyeing his hair back in the 70s. He dyed it blonde when he put out his album Blondes Have More Fun. And Rod discovered that as a blonde, he had plenty of fun. Over the years, Rod's hair has been a number of different shades of blonde: strawberry blonde, dirty blonde, even platinum blonde. But if you happen to catch Rod Stewart on his current tour of the United States, you won't see a blonde. That's because recently Rod decided to change his hair color. It happened one day last month, right before a big show in Auburn Hills, right outside of Detroit. Rod says the weather was cold and bleak. He felt like he needed something to pick up his spirits, and he decided that a change of hair color would be just the ticket. And it's not a subtle change either. Rod dyed his hair red, a color that's almost orange, in the style of Lucille Ball. This weekend, Rod the Redhead brings his show and his new look to the MGM Grand Hotel in Las Vegas, where he'll sing songs like this number 1 smash from 1993, a Casey's Countdown Extra. This is Rod Stewart and Reason to Believe. From 1993, that's a Casey's Countdown Extra, Rod Stewart with his number 1 smash, Reason to Believe. Now, on with the survey.
Casey's Coast to Coast.